know most of it. We always just mention if you're visiting, outlines are on the back. This will be number 3. And we'll be looking at Esther chapter 2 in a little bit. We're going to drop back and do something from last week just for a little bit. It's always a blessing to get together and study God's Word. I just sometimes try to imagine all the different places, especially since the first century, that Christians have gathered at one time or another to study and especially to worship. When I was a student at Oklahoma Christian, just went blank for a second, Otis Gatewood, who at that time was taking trips behind the Iron Curtain, smuggling in Bibles and everything, was speaking at Ridgecrest, and I just went and listened. And he said, brethren in the Soviet Union, of course this is before the Iron Curtain fell, he said on Sunday they were all health nuts. They walked, but they had an agreed area in a park that they would stop and meet. And if you know a covey of quail, they do kind of like a circle, put their tails together so they can all look out. Well, the brethren would be in a circle and look over each other's shoulder. And if they saw someone coming they didn't know, then they just disbanded and walked for a while. But one brother brought some unleavened bread. Another sister brought some grape juice. And so they would worship while they were out hiking and walking in parks on the Lord's Day. And it's just such a blessing because you think we're a part of a heritage of people who've done this for centuries. One of the things we didn't get to touch on, and I will just do this very quickly, last week, remember we had talked about the statue that was, the interpretation was given to Daniel in chapter 2, and the head was of gold, and then the upper part of the body was of silver. Well, and this is going to be the Mede and the Persian Empire. I wanted to go ahead and do the connection into the next one just very briefly. And so the thighs and the legs are going to be of bronze, and this is going to be the coming of Alexander the Great. And so the Persian Empire is going to last, and again, I always just point to the wall. Remember, the handwriting comes out on the wall in Daniel, and we're going to be in 539 BC. Mene, tekel, parsin. You have been weighed and weighed in the balances and found wanting. And that night, the Babylonian Empire fell as they diverted the Euphrates River around the city. But the Mede and Persian, but we typically say the Persian Empire, which was this part of the vision, then it is going to last from 539 down roughly till the 330s, 331 or something. And what took place as we moved from the waist down toward the thighs to the part that's bronze, the Macedonians were, I'm trying to think the best way to, let me do it this way. Do you remember, well, there was a time that it wasn't a compliment to be called an okie. My grandparents ran a general store from 1924 to 1942, so think Dust Bowl Dirty 30s. And my grandmother maintained if we ever could have recovered the gas, tires, oil, food that we gave to people who moved to California that we never saw again, we could have retired. And literally after they closed the store, because you think 42, World War II, rationing, you're 10 miles out of town, the whole family worked for 5 years to pay off the debts that they had incurred from all these friends and neighbors who had starved out and had left. And so especially if you're in California, being called an okie was not a compliment. Well, back in the 300 BC, that's how the Greeks looked at the Macedonians. They were very warlike, they were very athletic. Can I use the word thick, and you know what I'm trying to say? Looking at it from a Greek point of view, who had felt like we're more educated and we're more well-versed in the world. Can I use the word backward? That's kind of how the Greeks kind of looked down their nose at the Macedonians. Well, the king that came into power, his name is Philip. And as one of my teachers said, a lot of these guys were very modest characters. They went around naming cities after themselves. And so the book of Philippians is written to the church in Philippi that's named after Alexander's father. So as he kind of consolidates the Macedonian Empire, so here's Greece, and you're going to go up Thessaly, and you're headed right up toward the top there. He names Philippi after himself. Alexander has a half-sister, and her name is Thessaloniki. Nikao is the word for conquer. Thessala, they won a battle, Nike, and so hence they named Alexander's half-sister Thessalonica, and this is on the back page of last week. If you have that, you can kind of come back and look at it. So the father names Philippi, the sister Thessalonica. Philip is killed, the father's killed, and Alexander's 18, and very much like Augustus is going to do later, they were absolutely just stunned that at such a young age that he started consolidating things so quickly. Legends have Alexander was riding a horse by the time he was 2. And because the Macedonians were looked down upon, his father said, we're going to bring a tutor up from Greece to help personally tutor my son. It was a young man that no one had ever heard of, and his name was Aristotle. So just imagine this, Alexander the Great's personal tutor growing up is the philosopher Aristotle. You know, college students need a job. They need something to do while they're kind of getting established and things. And so Philip sent word down to Athens, you know, I want someone young, someone that can talk to my son, someone's of that age, who's kind of the best, can I use our term, young kid on the block? And they looked around and says, well, here's this unknown kid called Aristotle that nobody knows, but he seems like he's a pretty bright kid. And so we'll send him up to tutor your son. Can you imagine? Alexander the Great is being tutored by the philosopher who eventually becomes Aristotle. Why am I mentioning that? Through that, as military-minded, as athletic, and as conquering as he was, Alexander also had a very deep, profound sense of culture put deep inside of him through his studies with Aristotle. And so when they consolidate things in Macedonia, they go into Greece and they give them warning. They say, you need to surrender. And I think it was the city of Thebes said, we're not. And I mean, Alexander leveled the place. And then he sent messengers out the second time and he says, see what happened here? Everybody, I'm sorry. Did any of you use the word kephrope growing up if you were wrestling and you were about to get hurt or you wanted to give up? And when we were growing up, if you just were saying, okay, I'm done, I quit, that may be too much of a farm term. Brad, did you ever hear that? We're little kids, we're wrestling, and if you're getting the worst of it and you're getting pinned down, if you holler kephrope, then that means, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. If you're my friend, we're going to stop. Well, after he destroyed that one city, the rest of the Greek city said, kephrope, we surrender. And then Alexander said, the Persians control all of our Greek cousins on the west side of Turkey, Asia Minor. Let's all get together and cross over the Hellespont like the Persians had done last week when they came in 490 and 480. And let's free all of our Greek cousins on the west coast. And so they gathered all the forces together. Because he's 18 years old, what normally takes 3 days, they did in a night and a part of a morning. And they started there, and they're going to end up in India. Next time you look at a map, just kind of look at that. They start coming down the west coast of Asia Minor, and Alexander the Great, the term is, conquered the known world. Basically, it was the Persian Empire. They're going to quickly go through Asia Minor. They're going to come down through Israel. They're going to quickly conquer Egypt. And being the modest character he was, he only named 31 cities after himself during this 10-year period of time. But the best known city was Alexandria in Egypt. Okay, so just look at your New Testament. Philippians is Alexander's father. Thessaloniki, you hear it now, is Alexander's half-sister. And other than Athens, the most academic-based place in the ancient world is going to be Alexandria in Egypt. At one time, the library in Alexandria had 700,000 scrolls. We're not talking about books, we're talking about scrolls. Can you imagine how many buildings you would have to house 700,000 scrolls? Virtually all of our manuscripts and all of our writing from antiquity comes to us through Alexandria in Egypt. Alexander perfected something called the phalanx. It's kind of like an armadillo in terms of it's all the guys on the front have a shield, the guys in the middle have shields, the guys on the outside have shields, and then they have these like 8 and 10 foot spears in the middle, and this thing moves forward into the Persians, and they throw arrows and everything else at it, but it's movable, and everybody on the outside and on the top have these shields, and once they break into enemy lines, then they disband behind, and the Persians never did figure out how to stop that. They went all the way to India, and finally his troops said, we're not going to do this anymore. You had to be young to stay up with him. He dies within 10 years, and 4 generals divide up the empire, but we're just going to do one thing. The word koine, K-O-I-N-E, is the language that our New Testament is written in. And it would never have happened without something like Alexander, because all of these little Greek city-states, here were the Ionians, and here were the Spartans, and here were the Athenians and the Thebans, and they all had their own kind of Greek dialect. They could and kind of couldn't understand each other. What happens if you put everybody in the same tent for 10 years? What happens if we're in a phalanx and we all have to know to move forward and back? If you don't understand, it's kind of like evolution, you get exterminated. It was the survival of the fittest. And so the Koine language that our New Testament is written in is developed in the tents of Alexander. Now, take a step back. Do you remember the 3 levels that we've talked about, particularly as we study the Old Testament? And again, always do Joseph, the simplest, 37 through 50, biographical, here's the young man sent to Egypt when he's 17. But while all of this is going on, we can come back and say, and then God is forming a nation. This is what he's doing with his people. And then on the top, we can come back and look at these first 2 things. And to me, the thing we do a little bit less, but to me is the most important, we can come back and say, what does this tell us about God? Jerusalem's conquered 3 times. First time by the Babylonians, 606. Nebuchadnezzar comes back, 598, 597, conquers again. The third time, 587, 586, they destroy the city. And this dispersion of Jews begins to take place, and many Jews are going to live in foreign countries forever. And there's a sense that you could get the feeling, what's the use? Has God totally forgotten us? The city is lying in ruins. And remember, we've looked recently, the walls have been destroyed for 142 years. But in the midst of all this chaos, way off over in Babylon, God gives Daniel a very precise vision through this statue. This is exactly what's going to take place for the next 500 years. And all of these different nations are going to rise and fall, and the events are going to take place, the cultures are going to be developed, and so that by the time of the New Testament, the Greek language, thanks to Alexander, has been spread all over the empire. And so in Egypt, from 270 to 250, you'll sometimes see the initials, the Roman LXX is called the Septuagint. 70 Jewish scholars got together, and they got to thinking, if our children are going to know about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we need to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. So in many of the synagogues, when Paul goes about preaching the gospel, obviously he can do either one, but I'm sure, 90% of our quotations in the New Testament are from the translation of the Septuagint. But here's what I want you to see. Even at times where, from a human point of view, it seems like the bottom has dropped out, it seems like what's happening, what is taking place, God is still in control. And the same way, as we've said, and here's this wonderful parenthesis, in the same way, and sorry, let me just shake down the chills. God has a 17-year-old boy sold into slavery into Egypt. And like I said, I've mentioned this, but this still just grips me. Can you imagine going to sleep at night, 17 or 18 years old in the prime of your life, rotting in prison because of your sorry brothers? And you would just feel like this about this? But what's God doing? 13 years later, when they finally get back together, he says, you meant it for harm, but what? God meant it for good. Do you see what I'm saying? Even though he's betrayed, and this is the part that just haunts me, 10 brothers for 13 years watched an old man cry himself to sleep night after night and didn't peep. How do you live with yourself to cause untold grief to your father, and they never said a word? But do you see what I'm saying? God's involved. And God's doing things that from the human point of view, they couldn't see at the time. And that's why you'll continue to hear me say this. Today, we will learn more about God from the rear view mirror than we do from the windshield. Did you get it? We will learn more about God through the rear view mirror than we will from the windshield. And so, when we come to the book of Esther, then God has sent in 606, with that first group of captives, another young man of sterling character, Daniel. Joseph's been sent south at the opening toward the end of the Old Testament. Daniel's going to be split to the north and to the east, and he will live his entire life there. And this is why, again, I love this expression. As Jerusalem's destroyed and the temple's in ruins, the people who write about God will now refer to him as the God of heaven. And Jerusalem has a special place in their hearts, but now God, rather than being the God of a territory, is the God of the stars. And so the same God of Jerusalem is going to be the same God in Persia. And I want us just to have that in our minds, that oftentimes, and it doesn't happen simultaneously, but oftentimes we will have events happen in our lives, and at some point we will look back and say, oh, I can see the hand of God in that. I started Oklahoma Christian in the fall of 1970, and didn't have a car. So was pretty well, not pretty well, I was on campus unless you borrowed a vehicle. And when I started school, I could name 5 people by name on campus. So you lived in a small community, you've grown up on a farm, and then you go to this kind of strange place, and here you are with a whole group of people you've never met before, and you're just trying to kind of survive and make it. And so somewhere between the first semester, my brother would just do this at the drop of a hat. It was harder for me to ask somebody out. That wasn't the easiest thing to do. And I just thought about it and prayed about it. So on Tuesday, there was a campus activity on Friday. And so you're trying to be thoughtful. And so I get the directory out and I call 3 girls on Tuesday to ask them out on Friday. Get ready. The first one says, I would like to, but I know I'll be doing my fingernails on Friday. The second one said, I would like to go, but I'll be washing my hair on Friday. And the third one said, I would really like to go, but I'll be studying on Friday. So I hang up the phone. I think, these are the most organized girls I've ever been around in my life, that on Tuesday, they all know what they're going to be doing on Friday. Okay, the nearest place to get a Coke is where the Walgreens is. Mardell's Walgreens. If you go off campus, that's the nearest place. By Cholinos, there was a Dairy Swiss. So Leslie, you need to have a girl on either the track or the cross-country team who will have a date with you if you go off campus, because how would you don't have to worry, sweetheart, about what you get, because we'll walk it off before we get back. It would be like a 3 to 4 mile walk before we got back. And so you're just kind of trapped. I tried unsuccessfully 5 times to talk to Sheila, and I was so smitten I could not get anything to come out of my mouth when I got next to her. It just wouldn't happen. And I'd kick myself and say, I'll talk to her next time. 12th of January, 8:45, New Testament survey. I'm going to ask that girl out or I'm going to faint. And I took a deep breath, and I thought, no, I need to count to 3 and just go do this. So I went up to her and I said, if we have a basketball game Friday night, would you like to go out and get something to eat afterwards? She said, well, you're playing basketball, you should know. And I think, well, this is going great. This is just exactly how I had it planned. And finally I said, well, assuming we do, would you like to go out and get something to eat afterwards? She said, yes. And I said, are you sure? Because I'm used to girls who are so organized that, yes, it's on Tuesday and I'm asking for Friday, and she finally says yes. Anyway, got that over. We had started dating 2 or 3 weeks, and I said, we need to talk. Everything's fine. Don't get upset. Everything's fine, but we need to talk about something because it's not fair to you. And so if you're the girl, you're thinking, okay, what are we going to talk about? And I said, this isn't 100%, but I have seriously thought about the possibility of going to work in Australia someday, and it's not fair for us to be dating for a long time and you not know that. And guess what she says? Isn't it wonderful when the other person finally says we? She says, well, if we decide to do that, I would love to, because when I was 12 years old, I told my mother I'd like to go work in the church in Australia someday. "1,800 students are on campus. You try 5 times unsuccessfully and nothing comes out of your mouth, and you finally get up the nerve to ask her out, and when you finally get to dating for a while, and you said, well, this is something that I've really thought about. And so April the 3rd, 1979, she hugs her mother goodbye. We're gone for 3 years. Luke's 9 months. And she says, Mom, do you remember? And she said, yes, but I didn't think you would actually do it. Do you see what I'm saying about the rearview mirror? And this is why studying things like the book of Esther are helpful, because here's a time that from the surface, God's people are at a low. They're in captivity. A lot of things are happening that aren't going their ways, but God is still going to be busy and God's still going to be at work. So we're going to start, and there's a quotation here at the very top of the page. I'll let you read that. The Persians had 127 provinces. Using our term, the Pony Express, they had the most sophisticated messenger service the ancient world had ever known, and that's how the message had been sent out. So we're in chapter 2 and verse 1. When the anger of King Ahasuerus, and this is Xerxes, had abated, he remembered Vashti and what he had done and what he had decreed. The king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful virgins be brought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, together all the beautiful young women into the harem at Susa under the custody of the king's eunuch, and let cosmetics be given to them, and the young woman who pleases the king will be queen. And this pleased the king, and he did so. Now, we're only going to say this in a sentence. Last week, we noticed there's an early part in the book of Esther. There's a delay about 4 years, and during that time, that's when the Persians crossed through Asia Minor, and the first group went into Greece in 490. Xerxes is going to go back in 480 and 479. And so the gap in the book of Esther, most students feel like, is the time that the king is gone on the failed Greek invasion. So there was a Jew, and notice how this is introduced. We're going to have 3 main characters that develop the plot of the story. And the very first thing the writer wants us to know is the word Jew. is a derivative of Judea, and this became kind of the common designation of the Israelites in exile. They're particularly going to be called Jews. And his name was Mordecai. And they give a family tree that goes all the way back and ends up even through the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. And this is done sometimes in the Old Testament genealogies. Different ones will be selected without giving you the beginning and the end. And so roughly, from the Jewish point of view, here's the background of this Jew. Here are significant people without listing all of them in his family tree. Now here's verse 7, and this is a very important marker for our book. Mordecai was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, and we'll see these in a little bit. Hadassah is going to be her Jewish name. Esther is going to be her Persian name. The daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. So if I do the family tree right, this is an older cousin who basically has adopted her when her folks have died. Okay, everybody kind of see the relationship that's there. And he's very much going to be her father from all practical purposes. So what we're going to find out, here's an orphan who has been adopted by an older cousin. Okay, everybody got the family tree? She was a young woman. She had a beautiful figure, was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So the king's order and his edict were proclaimed. Many of the young women were gathered into Susa, the capital. Esther was taken, and this word taken, it sometimes is like put in custody. So this isn't like the girls all were able to necessarily volunteer. I don't know if scouts went out, if people located the girls, but some of them probably even against their preference or their will, or said, okay, you're going and you're going to be a part of this. And so she was taken into the king's palace, put in the custody of Hegai, who was in charge of the women, and the young woman pleased him and won his favor. She's provided with cosmetics, a portion of food, 7 chosen young women, and they advanced her and the young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her to not make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now, here's something to anticipate. And this is why I love continuing doing stuff like this. I come across a writer, and he said, there are some very interesting parallels to Joseph's prison time and Esther's time when she's in this holding pattern. And look at that term, found favor. And we'll look at that later, but anticipate and just kind of start looking at that comparison. There's going to be some similarities in terms of what happened, and we'll come back to that. So here's verse 12, chapter 2. The turn came for each of the young women to go into the king after the 12 months of regulation, and she went into the king and was given whatever they desired to take. In the evening she would go in the morning she would return. She would not go into the king again unless he delighted in her and she summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, and again notice the name, the daughter of Ahabiel, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch who had in charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. Anticipate, what is Joseph doing in Potiphar's house? See what I'm talking about? Other than the business of Potiphar and his wife, Joseph is basically in charge of that. He's then put into a prison, and what happens in the prison? God helps him to find favor of those with whom he's in custody. So, verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the women. She won, and isn't this interesting, grace and favor in his sight, more than all of the virgins, and so he set the royal crown on her head. and made her queen instead of Vashti. The king gave a great feast for his officials and his servants. It was Esther's feast. He granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. So we're introduced to two of the main characters, and the orphan who's now been adopted, and obviously he's going to be very open to taking the advice of her cousin, and this will come up here in just a second. Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate, verse 19. Esther had not made known her kindred to her people, for Mordecai had commanded her, and Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. Can you see some people saying, well, I'm the queen and I'm now my own boss and no one's going to tell me what to do? There's some very significant, I think, kind of insights into the character of the people who are involved here, because even with the promotion and all the things that take place, she's still going to be following the instructions of Mordecai. So, as he's coming by the gate, two characters, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus, Xerxes. This came to the knowledge of Mordecai. He told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. And when the affair was investigated and found to be so, some traditions will say the men were hanged on gallows, and they may have been impaled on wooden stakes. That's a practice that was known to the Persians and was very, very familiar with that. And so these are the events that take place that kind of take the story along and develop the plot from there. One of the things, and I'm going back to the first chapter, do you remember all of the banquets and the feast and the parties, but specifically the drinking that took place in the first part? And like in any kind of short story, there are some details we'd like to know more about. Nothing is said about Vashti's motives for not wanting to go in by the king's orders. But you look at it and you think, this is a drunken brawl. Do you really want to be paraded around in front of just this drunken feast? And then you also look at this expression, when the king's anger had subsided. He made some decisions while he's intoxicated that he may not have made when he was sober. And that to me is just one of those little quiet things that goes through that first part. And reading through this, there's some sections in Proverbs that come to mind. And I'm in Proverbs 20 and verse 1. Wine is a mocker, strong drink is a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise. And then look at the list. And again, this is talking about excessive drinking. But I'm in Proverbs 23, starting, first of all, verse 1. Who has woe, who has sorrow, strife, wounds, redness of eyes, down to verse 30. Those who tarry long over wine, and you go through this whole thing. In the end, it will bite like a serpent and sting like an adder. You'll be like one who lies down in the midst of the sea. And there's just a very clear warning about the impact and the problems that come along with excessive drinking. When you look at the next page, and again, and just reflecting on Proverbs from the story that we've been reading, Proverbs 31 and verse 4, it is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine or for rulers to take strong drink. And what has just happened in chapter 1? There has been the party to end all parties. Everyone has a different kind of goblet, and the instructions are, everyone drink whatever you want to, choose your own preferences. And the things that led to the king's, from our point of view, bad decision of deposing Vashti, underneath all of this is the drinking and the partying that was going on. Do not give strong drink to kings or rulers, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed and pervert the right of the afflicted. Give strong drink to one who's perishing. And so there's going to be a part of Xerxes' character that's impetuous. He has a very strong sense of vanity, which was a part of his invasion of Greece. And this happens to anyone who's been in ministry for a while. I never read these passages in Proverbs, but just a true incident comes to mind. As we started the church in Campbelltown, and again, if Oklahoma City is about 3.5 million, and you got to go across the river, just that first town right there when you come into Oklahoma City, that's where Campbelltown was. We had a new family come to us. They were a blended family. Both of them had been married previously, partners had left. They had 2 lovely children each. So here's this beautiful family. And my brother Kent just gave a lesson on Sunday and talked about these things from Proverbs. And, it wasn't, thou shalt never drink at all, but it was just say, here's what Scripture says. Here's the warnings about excessive alcohol. Well, I had been studying with a young man nearly 12 months, and nearly every week, and he was living with this girl, and he was one of the few people who had a Bible, was reading his Bible before we started, and we were talking about baptism, and I said, what about your living relationship? And he said, well, since I'm not sleeping with anyone else but her, then God must think it's okay. And I said, well, was it wrong the first time you slept with her since she wasn't your wife? And he said, yes. So I said, doing what was wrong for 12 months makes it right. And so we were having, this was going to be a major decision in his life, what to do. So we stopped for, 6 weeks or 2 months. And I get a call on Friday, and this is the young man, and he says, are you still open on Monday? I said, yes, sir. He said, well, I've made some major decisions, and I'm ready for us to get together, and let's open the book and hit it again on Monday. Well, what happened is that our young couple at church and this young man had common friends, and 3 of these guys were going up to Queensland to look at some real estate, but the young man who had heard the lessons on excessive drinking was invited first, and he talked to his wife, and he said, Kent's lesson on Sunday was exactly what's going to take place while we're gone. I think I should decline. So when he declined, they called my friend, who we're going to study on Monday. On Saturday night, a truck had jackknifed across the road, and the 4 of them drove under the truck in a rainstorm, drinking, and were all decapitated at the waist. So they call 4 families and say, how much did they weigh? And they put that much weight in 4 body bags and sent them back to Sydney. I'm asked to do the funeral. You want to talk about a tough one? On Friday, let's get back together and let's study. I'm ready to make some decisions. And on Saturday, he loses his life, and then I'm supposed to do his funeral. His girlfriend, and this was his term, she likes the bottle quite a bit, and with this having happening, she just started drinking very, very strongly. I can't tell you how heartbreaking it is to do a service that for all the people there, this is the closest person to Jesus that any of them know. The building trade's tough. He carried a Bible on his dashboard. He read the Bible during breaks. And we had studied for nearly 12 months, and he's called me on Friday and said, let's get together. I'm ready to make decisions. And he loses his life on Saturday. Kent, Charlie, and Tony, our teammates, came and stood on the back wall and kind of held me up emotionally while doing this. And I just can't tell you how painful it was, because it's God's point to judge, but I know he hadn't been baptized. And I know we were going to talk about that on Monday, and it never did get to happen. She was mostly sober through the service. We went to the graveside, said a few words, and then she told the funeral home stop, and she demanded that the casket be open. Of course, it's just a body bag. And she takes off his ring, and she takes his Bible, and puts it in the casket and says, now you can close it. So she buried him and she buried God and went back to the bottle. Do you see what I'm saying? You can't ever read a section of passage like this again without those kinds of things coming back into your mind, because it's just such a strong reminder of that. Another thing is the dangers of pride and anger, and there'll be a whole list of these, but look at this. The fear of the Lord is the hatred of evil. Pride and arrogance, perverted speech, I hate. 16:18, pride goes for destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. And the same thing with anger. There's just, again, a whole group of these proverbs. Who is slow to anger has great understanding. 16:22, being of slow to anger is better than the mighty. 20 verse 2, the terror of a king is like the growling of a lion, and whoever provokes him to anger forfeits his life. Doesn't that describe Xerxes? And just interesting to me as you read through the narrative of the story, then so many of these warnings and things come up from Proverbs. 22, 24, and 25. Do not make friends with a man given to anger, or go with a wrathful man, lest you learn his ways and entangle yourself in a snare. A man of wrath stirs up strife, and one given to anger causes many transgressions. So here's what I want you to just kind of stop and kind of do in a second. Put yourself in the place of the exiles. We've mentioned Psalm 137 before. You know, here we are, and this was just a little bit earlier, but they're still in exile. Here we are in captivity, and our captors require us, sing to us some of the songs of Zion. And you think, okay, here's a city that's in ruins, and the temple's been destroyed, and we're far off away in captivity, and they're mocking us, and they're making fun of us. Like, yes, let's just sing it up about Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? I know this is Babylon. I know this is exiles. I sometimes think about this in terms of us being Christians. We are strangers. We are sojourners. We are pilgrims. And I just love the emotion of this psalm. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, and then let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you and hold you above my highest joys. And yet, God's people are called to keep faith regardless of what's going on around them. And I'm back with Daniel again. Here's this young man, and what does he do as a young man? 3 times a day, opens the windows, turns his face toward Jerusalem, and as an exile in a foreign land, then he prays 3 times a day back to the home country and to the homeland. I was at a conference where a lot of talks were given by missionaries once, and sometimes you hear something that just always sticks with you. And here was a guy that had been on the mission field 20 or 30 years, and he said, one of the most important verses to me for those who are doing missions of all things is in the book of Jeremiah. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm ready. What is it? And it was Jeremiah 29 in verse 7. Seek the welfare of the city. And you're just not there by accident. What is said next? Where I have sent you. Do you see what a different perspective that is for an exile? It's one thing to think, oh, they captured me and they carried me off against my will. But Jeremiah says, here's what God wants you to do. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Can you imagine growing up milking cows and working on a farm in a town of 3,000 people and waking up one day in a city of 3.5 million people halfway around the world? And I believe there's a lot of similarities. We had 3,000, and here we are with 3 million. There's an S and an E and a Y in Sayre and Sydney. There's one harbor bridge, and we had one stoplight. So there's just a lot of parallels between the two places. But having listened to that talk, I wanted to know every detail that I could about the city where I was living. How it was started, how it developed, what took place, who were the main people. And we're so grateful to be able to still go back, and North Mac helps us to do that. But this happens virtually every time that I'm there. Someone will say, well, what about such and such and such and such? And the Australians will say, go ask Dale, he knows our city better than we do. And so I still read 1 or 2 books a year, either about Sydney or about Australia, because seek the welfare of the city where you are, and in seeking the welfare of the city, you'll find your own welfare. We had a girl that came from Texas, and she would just tell you, I never had culture shock, I never had any adjustments, everything just went fine. And the older missionary said the reason is she never left Texas. She lived in another place, but she never adapted. She never located local things. She was just a Texan living halfway around the world. And you stop and think, what are we to be doing as strangers and exiles in the world? I still like the expression, a part of our call is to increase the population of heaven. And wherever we are, let's learn the city, let's learn the people, let's learn the background, and learn as much about them as we can to help bring those people to the Lord. When you look at the term, the people who are scattered abroad, the technical word is diaspora, and that's the spreading, those who are out. And you read of 15 nations in Acts chapter 2. And so from the time of the Babylonian captivity and even to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, then Jews are going to be spread out and scattered into all different parts. So we're at number 6, we're about to close. Esther gives us some insights for how to live in exile in a foreign land. They're not leading revolt. They're not politically active in a negative way. Esther is respectful and listening to the advice of her cousin Mordecai, even as she becomes queen. And Mordecai is also then going to be loyal to his king. And this will become a part of the plot later. He hears these 2 men talking about killing the king, turns them in, and turns out it's true. And eventually, a few years later, Xerxes is going to be killed by people within his own kingdom. But at this time, Mordecai is loyal to the king, even though he's in exile, and he turns in the information that causes him to actually be saved. And here's our last thought. God's will is oftentimes done in spite of human frailty. And you think, God is faithful to his covenant. And he makes this covenant with his people, and the majority of the time, the people are faithless. But God is still faithful. And so as the narrative unfolds, and as we continue to walk through this, then here's a story of 2 cousins, one an orphan, adopted, and of all things, she ends up living in the royal palace as the queen. And then here's now her cousin on the outside, and this will still become a part of the unfolding of the story. But God's faithfulness will be emphasized all the way through. And as we opened, what did we say? With the book of Song of Solomon, this is the only other book in the Bible that doesn't mention the name God specifically, but the providence of God and the working of God and the hand of God is going to be seen in all the activities all the way through. Here's our closing verse. Here's God's faithfulness, and this is 2 Samuel 7:14. God says to David, I will be to him a father, he will be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, the stripes of men, but My steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took from Saul, whom I put from before you, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever. So, 1,000 years later, Jesus comes into the world, and we've been starting the book of Romans on Sunday morning. And in that opening section, how does Paul describe Jesus? Physically, a descendant of David. And so what God told David 1,000 years earlier, he's going to bring about. And Jesus is going to be the descendant of David. And the same God that works in people in Scripture is working in our lives. And given time and given grace, at some point, we will all look through the rearview mirror about something that we struggle with or something that was hard. And looking back, we'll think, you meant this for good, or sorry for bad, but God meant it for good. And little by little, we'll all see the work and the fingerprints of God in our own lives.